All right, folks, it's time. It's chapter 13 on information systems and most importantly, internal controls. Probably the most boring topic in all of human existence, despite the fact that I like it. Not everybody else does, but a very important topic nonetheless. But you thought I was joking when I said I was going to bring Red Bull, but what did I buy at the grocery store yesterday? There you go. There you go. All right. So if you need it, it's going up on the table right over here. By the way, if you do need it in the class and open a Red Bull, do not spill it over the computer. If you spill it over the computer, I'm going to deny all culpability. I say, I told them not to open it. I told them not to open it. But yeah, I'm going to set it right here and grab one if you need one. So they're sugar-free and sugared. I guess the sugar-free is if you want still taste something really, really awful, and but you don't want the calories. While I'm waiting for people to grab the Red Bulls, again, feel free. I'm not going to judge you if you want the one. But yeah, I do have some announcements that I want to make sure that we're clear on. Check it right here. Oh, okay. That was so while you all are grabbing your cans of Red Bull, keep in mind that we have got a regular week this week. We're going to be doing chapter 13. Okay. Chapter 13 is going to be covering, like I said, information controls. We have our final chapter next week. Our final chapter is going to be on fraud and cybersecurity, which will be a little bit more interesting this week. After our final chapter, we're going to start with our next exam. So we've got a lot going on next week that you all need to be aware of. So, exam review on the 18th on Friday. That's going to be right after the day off for the Student Research Conference and then right before Easter break. I suspect that many of you will want to be traveling. That's kind of a natural inclination, is that they're going to have a Thursday off and a Monday off, that many will be traveling home. I'm not requiring you that you be here in class, but keep in mind that if you are going to attend via Zoom, you do have to let me know in advance so that you won't be here. It's really important that you be here for that Friday, simply because we will have an exam the Wednesday after we have the spring, or I guess the term break, I guess is what it's called. I didn't plan on that just to be right after that break. That was unfortunate, but the way it fell in the schedule. So please keep in mind that even if you're going to be on that break and that extended weekend, we are going to be coming into an exam, and the exam review is right before that. Your professional interactions are also due a week from Friday. If you've not already submitted your professional interaction, please keep in mind that's something that you need to do. I'm assuming most of you by now have actually had your professional interaction, so please make sure you take care of that and review the syllabus instructions for the professional interaction. It's pretty straightforward. It's basically a page, paragraph about what the professional interaction was about. The second paragraph about what you learned from it. Pretty straightforward. I've already received some, and I've graded most of them. Graded all of them that I've received so far, and in general, they look pretty good. So not a particularly difficult assignment. Also, after the exam, we're going to come back in on Friday of week 14. We're going to review the exam results, and that's when your AI research project part 2 is also due. So again, a lot coming up in the very near future. So next week, exam review, your professional interactions, week 14, exam number 2, and then your research projects due. And then week 15, that's when the presentations are going on. I put that online about when people are presenting. It seemed like everybody wanted to get out of the way earlier, signing up for Monday, Wednesday. So there may only be Friday days left if you're not already signed up yet. All right. With that, we are going to start with our discussion on internal information system and internal controls. Now, I've talked about internal controls to some degree already in this course, and this is going to be a deep dive on internal control frameworks. I can't insist upon how important I think this is. I think concepts of internal controls are really, really critical because they're going to be something that you encounter at every level of business. You cannot run a business without controls. It's just not practical to do so, simply because the nature of operations means that you have to address risks. So let's talk about the foundational stuff with respect to controls. And then when I'm going through this, part of the reason that I wanted everybody to have Red Bull and be very focused, just kind of like have that focus on the things I discussed, is there are going to be times that I'm going to say, this is really important, and you do need to know this for the exam. If you hear those words, that's when that Red Bull should kick in, and you should say, all right, this is really, really critical. I need to know this. I've said this every semester. There's certain things that I talk about in this chapter. I say, this is absolutely going to be on the exam. You need to know this in detail. And every single semester I get exams back where people just did not know any of the detail that I specifically said would be on the exam exactly verbatim. So if I say it's on the exam, it's on the exam, okay? So please keep that in mind. Now, complex definition of internal control, process designed to provide reasonable assurance and management objectives related to the quality of data, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and compliance with all applicable laws and regulations will be achieved. All right. That's how we technically define what an internal control is. My favorite definition is a much simpler one, though. It's a response to a risk. And I think I've given that definition already many times in this class. I think I've even given my silly example. Again, bear with me. I know this is a stupid example, but the more stupid the example is, the easier it is to remember. I said, if I walk outside to go check my mail and I go out barefoot, I might stub my toe. I might hurt my foot. So what's a simple solution to that? What's a simple solution to that risk? I wear shoes, all right? Shoes are internal controls, whereas we don't really think of them that way. It's kind of a sensible precaution that we would take to make sure that we don't hurt our feet. Especially me, as I get older, it's much easier to injure myself. That's just the way things go. Don't get older, guys. Don't get older. It sucks, okay? So, yeah, you start naysaying stuff like Red Bull and you can't drink the stuff anymore because it just does weird things to your body. So, yeah, same thing with Taco Bell. You stop enjoying Taco Bell because of that, yeah. Anyway, so broadly speaking, the goals of internal control are going to be to safeguard assets. We want to make sure that whatever organization assets we have in place, that we have security protocols in place to protect those. Some of those are going to be very, very straightforward. Like if we talk about a locked door, that could be viewed as an internal control. Some of them are going to be more subtle. We're going to talk about who has responsibility for certain types of assets, who can and cannot access. We want to maintain sufficient records. We're going to talk about the idea of going back to the IT controls. Remember, we talked about access and application controls. And one of the goals in application controls is to make sure that we have a trail of information that we can follow. We call it the audit trail. If we don't maintain proper records, then it's very difficult to actually maintain the audit trail. We want to provide accurate, reliable information. This is really important simply because we do need to know what the organization is doing and what they need to do. In order to be able to make those decisions, we need to know what the information is telling us. Provide financial reports according to established criteria. This is one of those ones that you're going to hear me talk about very, very basically, but one of those things that you learned about in 220. Very first thing you learned about, talked about the balance sheet and income statement and the statement of cash flows and all these things that accountants put together and generate, the system helps generate. What is the goal of the financial or these financial reports? And the answer is to provide information to external parties. In and of itself, financial statement reporting is a form of control. It's a form of an internal control. We also want to promote and improve operational efficiency. This is going to be less relevant to the financial reporting perspective, but keep in mind that organizations, as long as they're operating, they need to make sure that they're operating and following proper results. That's one of the things you learned back in 221. And those of you who are fortunate enough to take 367 with Dr. Otero learned about the operations of organizations are really important. It doesn't really matter how good the financials look. If the organization itself is not operating soundly, then it's not going to stay functional for a long time. So as much as I joke about Dr. Otero's teaching cost accounting and managerial accounting, there's a lot of respect there because it's the managerial accountants who kind of keep the organization running properly, running in the right direction. We want to encourage adherence with management policies. Keep in mind that management is going to set the tone for the organization. Quite literally, we're going to talk about that shortly. So we want to make sure that people understand what the rules are and what they're going to follow. We would rather have an organization that's got a strong tone rather than a weak tone. So it's important to note that. And then we're talking about compliance with laws and regulations. That term compliance, we've seen that before, and I use the term laws and regulations when I talked about compliance. Whatever the rules are of the industry we operate in, we have to follow those rules, and the internal controls are going to help us with that. So keep in mind that most of the controls that we talked about here, they're going to be financial reporting focused. They're going to focus on financial reporting results. We do see some that are going to be more about cost and managerial accounting focus. Those are operational controls. And then we see the controls that relate to compliance. The reason I bring that up is we're going to see a framework for that here in just a little bit. And I want to point out that these kind of fall under one of those three areas. All right. So three categories, general categories of internal control. And we've seen these before, but it's important to reiterate these. Now, these are general categories of control. We're going to talk about IT controls here in the next slide. And that's going to seem very familiar. But the general categories are going to be preventative, detective, and corrective. Now, preventive, I use the word preventive. You can use the word preventative. It's the same word. I don't know why I got on the term preventative, and then preventive is just shorter. I'm just wasting a syllable. You know, I don't have that much time in my life. Why would I waste my time using an extra syllable? So yeah, preventive controls. And basically preventive controls are going to stop bad things from occurring from the first place. All right. So you all came into the room, you sat down, you logged in your computer, and it said, all right, what is your user ID? What is your password? And that's a form of preventive control. It's trying to prevent people from accessing your account who are not you. So that password and that ID. And in some situations, you have to go a little bit further. Like when you log into the Microsoft tools and you log into your email, you know, you have to pull out your phone and you have to say dual authentication, you know, that multi-factor authentication. That'd be an extension of that preventive control. Whole point being is that we don't want persons who are not you from using your accounts. An example of preventive control. So from a business perspective, we could talk about this from authorization of transactions. So organizations, they do business by credit. We've talked about the business to business environment. They extend credit. We want to make sure that we're extending credit to only people who are going to pay us back. So at some point, there's going to be a credit authorization function that's going to say, all right, we do approve credit to this customer or we don't, because we think that there's a risk if we extend credit. That authorization is a preventive control. We're trying to prevent organizations from buying goods from us and not paying us. That's the example of that control. All right. Next type of control is going to be detective controls. These discover problems that are not preventive. So as much as we would like to rely on controls to prevent all problems, it's just not practical for us to do that. So the goal of these types of controls are going to say, we do not believe that all problems will be prevented. If they're not prevented, then we want to make sure we detect them and fix them as quickly as possible. So an example of this would be bank reconciliation and monthly trial balances. These are a review of historical items. So we can look at those items and say, this does not look right. Can we figure out what's going on here? And if it's a problem, fix it. All right. You will notice that I use detective controls, and I'm also kind of saying the word fix it. That is because when we think about detective controls, they are frequently, almost always used in unison with our third concept, which is called corrective controls. Corrective controls correct and recover from the problems that have been identified. Okay. We talk about corrective controls. Corrective controls say we need to identify the problem. Once we identify the problem, let's fix the problem. So backup files to recover corrupted data. So does everybody remember, how many people were here back 2 years ago in spring of 2023, I guess it was. You know, right around this time, it was actually in this computer lab when it happened. It's like, you got to notice, is that, yeah, Dr. Barnes, we have to log off right now. Something bad's going on with the computer system. Like that was the ransomware attack. How did Trim State resolve the ransomware attack? They actually had backup files from their from the network drives that they used. Now, it's important to note those backup drives were only run every 2 weeks, so we lost several weeks worth of data when we did the backup. But it was a corrective control, a problem that occurred. We detected the problem, then we fixed the problem. All right, that's how Trim State did that. And that's actually a happy ending, even though it was very, very inconvenient at the time. It was very problematic at the time. It's a happy ending that happened. That's not so happy endings have occurred from ransomware attacks in the past, but we'll get more into that next week. All right, so Chapter 5 also said there are 2 broad categories of controls related to information systems. So just as a reminder for this, okay? We talked about these are access controls or general controls, as they often called, okay? Does access controls limit who can access information system, the areas of information accessible to each user? So when I talk about users, remember we talked about this in terms of one word. Remember that was the word employee, what the employee can do, okay? So these pertain to enterprise-wide issue, controls of access to the network, developing and maintaining applications, etc. What one individual who works for the organization or has access to the organization's resources is able to do. Technically speaking, it's probably more broad than just employees. We can have individuals who this applies to that are not employees of the organization. But for simplistic purposes, we're just going to keep this to employee access. That's kind of the easy way to think about it. Application controls. These are automated processes that provide detail for data integrity and an audit trail. And these are specific to a subsystem or an application to ensure the validity, completeness, and accuracy of the transactions. In other words, this is saying what the information the system tracks, okay? In fact, that is actually when we talked about this, when we use the word application controls, okay? What is the entity we're concerned about? That is the actual system itself, the IT system itself. What the IT system does to make sure that if there are any problems, that can actually correct those problems. So they fall kind of cleanly into the preventive and corrective controls. Broadly speaking, access controls are more going to be preventive in nature, whereas application controls are going to be detective and corrective. That is not a whole representation. That's not exactly true for every scenario, but it's going to be generally true for the scenarios we're going to be talking about. All right, everybody feel pretty good about their access or understanding of internal controls, okay? We're feeling good, so like, got the Red Bull in the system, okay, we got the information about internal control, the vibes are flowing through us. All right, then we go, a pop quiz, here we go. This is not an actual pop quiz, there's no grade for it. Okay. But what do these companies have in common? Have we seen these companies' names before? Hopefully you've seen at least one of these names, that big E, okay? Every person who's in business and accounting class, who's taking a business accounting class should know the word Enron. It said Enron bad, okay? Enron bad. WorldCom is also bad. WorldCom is also bad, as well as Anderson. So just a little bit of background. This is companies that basically went bankrupt in the early 2000s. Enron was 2002. WorldCom was shortly thereafter, early 2003. And they had massive financial accounting scandals. And their auditor was a company called, or a firm called Enron, Anderson, okay? Anderson, they were actually part of the Big Five right now. How many Big Five, or Big Five at the time? How many accounting firms are there right now? Big accounting firms are there? There's 4. The reason there's 4 is because Anderson is no longer an accounting firm, at least not one of the Big 4 accounting firms. They technically still exist, but they're a minuscule fraction of what they used to be. So now no longer Big 5, it's a Big 4. So basically what happened is these companies were doing these massive accounting scandals, and their auditors, who should have been responsible for understanding what's going on with inside the organization, were saying, we don't know what you're doing, so we're just going to look at your financial statements and make sure they're okay. Which ignored a critical process. It ignored the fact that these controls should have been in place, preventing these companies from creating these massive financial accounting scandals. And so a lot of people identified this as a problem, saying, we understand that you're preparing these financial statements, but we have no transparency, no visibility into the inside of the organization. And that needs to stop right now. So shortly thereafter, we had the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Everybody here heard about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002? You probably know by a different term. You could call it SOX, S-O-X. I always wanted to get a dachshund and name it Sox, okay? I never got a dog, but I was going to call it Soxy the Doxy. I know, it's adorable. Yeah, anyway. Sox and Scooter for some reason. I wanted to have 2 dogs, but Sox would be the one. So what was the goal? It was to improve the transparency of corporate disclosures issued by publicly traded companies. We've talked about transparency already in this course, and we've said transparency is a good thing. Generally speaking, the more transparent the information is in an organization, the better off stakeholders are at knowing what the organization is doing. So Sarbanes-Oxley Act, their goal was transparency. And one of their big things to do was to actually improve the transparency of reporting by organizations. This included the controls in place of the organization. It also established this group called the PCAOB, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, to oversee the auditing of publicly traded companies. And this had 2 very profound effects, okay? 2 very profound effects. Management now had to actually take responsibility for internal controls as well as financial reporting. So companies management had to actually say, in addition to financial statement reports that we're going to issue, we are responsible for the internal controls in place in the organization. Also, it required auditors of these organizations to test internal controls. It was no longer an option. They actually had to test anything related to financial reporting. So internal controls became really important after 2002, which is why it's so prominent now, why we're talking about it. So it's documented in a few areas of related to organizational controls. One of these was going to be corporate governance, the organizational policies and procedures that safeguard stakeholder interest. The responsibility of those in charge of corporate governance, those are generally going to be the board of directors of the organization. And to a lesser extent, we could talk about the audit committee, those who oversee the audit. But basically, anybody who's a shareholder in the organization is going to have some sort of oversight. And corporate governance is kind of a window into that. The people who are in the position of the board of directors, they have to ensure that organizational policies and procedures, they're actually are benefiting the stakeholders of the organization. Now, when I say stakeholders, that's different from shareholders. Shareholders are actual owners of equity. Stakeholders is anybody with interest in an organization. So a little bit of delineation there. And then I mentioned the auditor oversight. It ensures high quality independent audits, financial statements, and internal controls. So yeah, a lot of changes have happened as a result of this. And a lot of people argue this was a good change. This is something that was important and needed in corporate America at the time. And even though it's not a direct result of Sarbanes-Oxley, many organizations also incorporated something called a code of ethics to define and promote organizational values. Because that was what was missing in a lot of organizations that are in the late 1990s or in the early 2000s, is the actual ethics of business, okay? So code of ethics was something that was kind of adopted by these large organizations to say, here's what we stand for, here's what we're going to be doing. That at least to some degree, they have some representation of what you should believe about them. So let's talk a little bit about something called SOX 404. And I always found this to be ironic because back in the old days of the internet, so we're talking about the 1990s and early 2000s, if you actually tried to find someplace and it wasn't there, it would be called a 404 error. And I thought it was funny that they actually made this section 404. The Sarbanes-Oxley section 404 actually specifies management's responsibilities regarding the design, implementation, and maintenance of internal controls. Okay. It also specifies auditors' responsibilities for understanding and testing controls, but for those of you who are accounting majors, we'll talk a lot more about that when you get to accounting 417. So we're not going to talk so much about auditor responsibilities, but we do need to understand the basis for internal controls because management is responsible for designing, implementing, and maintaining internal controls. And so we need to have a system of processes in place to understand how we're going to do that. So this is where we get into the point where we start talking about what are the methods that we can actually use to reinforce this, to actually reinforce internal controls? And the answer is there's a lot. We're going to go over one in a lot of depth, and then we're going to talk at a very high level about the remaining four. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about the frameworks, and then I'm going to elaborate on each of these. Okay. So the Securities and Exchange Commission, they require publicly traded companies in the United States to evaluate internal controls based on a recognized control framework. So with respect to organizational governance, we're going to talk about one control framework in particular. That's going to be the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework, COSO 2313. So COSO stands for the Committee on Sponsoring Organizations. And there's a little bit of background we can go into that. This actually, Committee on Sponsoring Organizations was created back in 1986 as part of the Treadway Commission to actually investigate fraud in organizations. And one thing they came up with is one of the best ways to detect and prevent fraud is to have internal controls in an organization. That was kind of the inception of that particular organization. They've evolved and expanded since then. And so what we see now, 2013 is the current framework for internal controls. We're going to talk very, very briefly also about the COSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework. I will tell you right now, other than knowing its name and knowing a few details about it, I'm not going to ask you too much information about this on the exam. Part of it is because the information that's in the book is actually wrong. The book information about the COSO ER framework is actually outdated. It's been updated since the book was published, the new framework. So we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. But also, the COSO ER framework is not actually substantially different than the internal control integrated framework. So in other words, if you know number one, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what the components of number two are. So I'm a big fan of not learning things twice or redundant learning. So we're just going to learn the first part and say, let's talk about how this loosely interprets to number two. Also, what we need to talk about is we need to talk about information technology governance frameworks, okay? Now, again, this is going to be very high level. When we get to these, we're going to talk about these at a very high level. Mostly what you need to know about these is what their names are. And you need to know what they cover with respect to controls, okay? We'll talk about that in just a bit. But there's three of these. There's control objectives for information and related technologies, which is COBIT, all right? Information Technology Infrastructure Library, which is ITIL. And the ISO, or International Organization for Standardization, or ISO 27000 series. By the way, if you're wondering, you notice say iOS and you said ISO, why is it ISO instead of iOS? And the answer is ISO, or the International Organization for Standardization, is actually a European organization. So ISO is actually some sort of interpretation of, I believe it's French. So in French, it's actually whatever the French words would be for International Organization for Standardization, but it'd be ISO. Okay, so I can't tell you exactly what it is because I don't speak French fluently, but I can tell you that that's the reason why it's ISO 27000 series. But we'll get more into that here at the very end. All right. For the next few slides, I'm going to tell you right now, as we start going into the COBIT integrated framework for internal control, okay? This is something that I focus very heavily on in the exam. There will absolutely be multiple questions on this. And when we get to the components of internal control, I expect everybody in this course to know not only what the component names are, but what they represent, okay? There will absolutely be a question on the exam about this, 100%. I'm telling you this now. I will tell you this during the study guide review. I'm going to tell you right now, know this, learn it, love it. If you don't, you're going to be minus several points on the exam, okay? Simply because I'm telling you, there's absolutely a chance that this will be covered on the exam, right? Absolutely, not a chance. This will absolutely be covered on the exam. All right. So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to talk about something called the COSO cube. Now the COSO cube has three faces. The front faces, as you can see. One of these faces is not particularly relevant. It is something for interpretation. It talks about what levels the controls can operate within an organization. And the answer is at all levels. They can operate as high as the entity level, okay? We can talk about entity level controls, and the easy example of entity level control would be a code of ethics that we talked about earlier. They can also go down to the functional level. We can talk about operations within an organizational department. So if we think about functional level, think about like a McDonald's store, okay? And somebody who's a cashier, there are specific controls to operations of a cash register in McDonald's. You don't open a cash register without a transaction. That's an example of control. Does that affect the organization as a whole? No, it affects one store and one functional area. So that would be an example of control that's kind of at the minor level, whereas it's like a code of ethics, which is control at the macro level, all right? What we do need to talk about is we need to talk about these other items up here. So these top items up here, these are the objectives of internal control. And the fronts on the front, these are the components of internal control. So there's a little bit of a difference. Let's talk about what those mean. So the objectives are very broad objectives of what control should accomplish, all right? Remember that earlier slide when I was going through those bullet points and I said, remember there's three categories. There's three categories we can talk about with respect to internal controls. Controls that relate to financial reporting, controls that relate to organizational operations, and controls relate to compliance of laws and regulations. There's a specific reason I categorized them that way, because I knew that we were going to come up to this slide right here. So the three objectives of internal controls according to the COSO framework are the reliability of financial reporting, the effectiveness and efficiency in operations, and compliance of laws and regulations. Now, interestingly, we're going to focus very heavily on the first one because we talk a lot about financial statements and financial statement analysis in this course, which is a result of financial reporting. But an accounting information system does need to be articulate in all three objective areas. So we do need to make sure that accounting information system controls are going to be in place that affect all three components: reporting, operations, and compliance, because they're all going to be relevant to the presentation of information and operations of the organization. All right, the components of internal control. In addition to the objectives, COSO 2013 is composed of 5 primary components: control environment, entities risk assessment, control activities, information communication, and monitoring. Now, again, I'm going to go through all of these in detail. We've got 5 slides in here that are going to go through this list. It is not sufficient for you to know the names of these. And anybody of you have ever heard of Becker, like the CPA exam review, Becker actually has a mnemonic for this particular one. I think the mnemonic is garbage because if you don't know what each of these components are in detail, it's really irrelevant. So as I'm going through these, take detailed notes because I will absolutely ask you a question on all 5 of these. You need to know these very, very well. I think this is not just important for this course, but it's important for all the courses you take as well as your business environment, because you do need to understand how controls function. So let's start out, okay? First thing we're going to talk about is control environment. And I'm going to tell you my personal opinion is the control environment of an organization is the most important component of internal controls. So in case that comes up on the exam, which is possible, if I say, in Dr. Barnes' opinion, what is the most important component? You should say control environment, okay? What is control environment? It is characterized by the actions and attitudes of individuals who lead the organization. We use the term tone at the top. That's kind of the vernacular that's used associated with this. This can include management's philosophy and operating style, the organization's commitment to integrity, ethical values, and competence, internal control charged by those charged with governance. So we talked about corporate governance a little bit earlier, and I said the board of directors and the audit committee, those are examples of people who are actually responsible for the governance of the organization, and the methods that are of authority and assigning authority and responsibility. So let's just think about this from a very basic level, all right? Can we say that I set the tone for the way that this class goes? We've got an exam coming up in a few weeks, all right? And let's say some of you ask, say, Dr. Barnes, is it okay if we're logged in our computers and so we can access our note and answer questions for the exam? I have 2 ways that I can respond to that, 2 basic ways. One way I could say, you are not allowed to log into your computers. Doing so would be a violation of an academic code of conduct, and I would consider that to be academic misconduct in this course. In other words, you would be cheating. I'm going to be very, very severe about that. I'm going to make sure that I walk through. There's not going to be any cheating class. You will see me paying close attention and watching your monitors, watching your notes, making sure that nobody's cheating. I will be aware of this the entire class period. That sends one message, right? Okay. Second message, you say, Dr. Barnes, can we be logged in our computers? Like, I don't care. I don't even plan on being here that day. Okay. Which sounds really ridiculous. You say, what kind of instructor would not even be in the classroom during the test? There's actually a former instructor I'm thinking of. He actually used to leave his classes during the test because he trusted his students. He trusted his students, which I have very high regard for my students, but I still believe that's a very, very naive approach to things. All right. So do those establish different tones, those two environments? If I say you may not use notes, you may not use your computer. I take cheating very seriously in this class. That's that one tone. And if I say, I don't care what you do, you guys can go ahead and make your own decisions. I'm checked out. It's close to the end of spring. That sets a completely different tone. Okay. Now think about that from an organizational perspective. If an organization says we are committed to the best values, we want to make sure that our employees and our stakeholders all have good experiences and that our operations are sound and ethical. We have integrity, free from fraud. If you're a stakeholder in that organization, you're like, okay, I appreciate that. I respect that. I hope that their operations actually match what they say. And you're going to observe the operations and management. If you have another one, it's like basically like we'll go with a fictitious company. We'll call them Enron. Okay. Whereas the CEO says, you know what? I really don't care what the shareholders say. I don't care what the stakeholders say. They're all a bunch of idiots anyway. So yeah, whatever they say, we're just going to do our own thing, and we're going to do what's best and makes a lot of money, but we don't care what people think. Which sounds outrageous, right? That's actually the kind of thing that Jeff Skilling used to say, by the way. He was the CEO of Enron for a while. He would say things like that. He actually called shareholders idiots. And so, yeah, calling your shareholders idiots, that probably sets a much different tone for the organization than if you say, I respect you and I want to do what's best for you. So you can kind of see the difference that this sets. This is the establishment of an attitude of some place at the top of what we're going to interpret is going to be representative of the whole organization. In other words, if the people at the top don't take control seriously, then nobody in the organization will take control seriously as well. It all starts at the top. Next one is going to be entities risk assessment. So risk assessment involves identifying and analyzing potential risk to an organization, both internal and external. This process involves determining what relevant risks exist, assessing the likelihood of existence or occurrence of these risks, estimating their significance, and deciding on how to manage these risks. So this is an interesting thought. In order to be able to establish controls, we have to understand what risk exists. Because remember, by definition, controls are a response to a risk. Okay? So if we're going to create controls, we have to know what are the risks. And there's a few parameters with those risks that we need to understand. We need to understand their likelihood and their significance. So why is that important? Because if we have a control or if we have a risk that we think, oh, wow, this is really significant, but there's a 1 in a million chance it will ever happen, it's probably not something we want to waste our time on. On the other hand, if we have something that's very likely to occur, but it's going to result in a misstatement of 35 cents, it's probably not something that we want to worry about for a perspective control. So the chances that will happen, and if it does happen, what will be the monetary impact? What will be the significant impact of that? And I use the monetary impact because that's how we generally quantify. I will say that controls have evolved to the point now for beyond quantitative dimensions. We can actually assess impact in terms of qualitative assessment, like employee dissatisfaction, perception of the market outside, things along those lines. Those still have indirect monetary impacts, but we can't assess things in terms of non-quantitative, quantitative significance. All right, let's go to the next part. This is control activities. Now, before I get into the control activities list here, the easy way to think about control activities is these are the controls themselves, okay? This is where we create those controls in response to those risks. So the policy and procedures that address and identify risks. So there's examples of these from physical and IT controls, authorization of transactions, use of documents and records, safeguards over assets, records, and data, and my favorite, segregation of duties, okay? Custody, authorization, and recording. So we talked about segregation of duties. That's an example of a control activity. I identify 3 people in a process area and say, you have custody of the records in this area, or custody of assets in this area. You're responsible for recording transactions and you authorize those transactions. Your responsibility should never overlap. That way we have strong internal controls in this area. That's an example of a control activity. We also have IT controls, okay? Remember our general access controls, which operate at the entity level, and the application controls, which can include input controls, process controls, and output controls. Generally speaking, these still apply to the parameters that we've talked about before. The general access controls are going to be the employee or the user access. and the application controls is going to be what the system records as part of the activity. So that has not changed. It's just a matter of characterizing this according to those control activities. Now, the question is having controls enough? Is having just controls in place enough? All right. So if I say, all right, nobody in this classroom should log in their computer without a user ID and password, and we mandate that saying user ID and password, that's the case. Well, that's possibly a good policy to have in place, but if I don't ever communicate that, then that's problematic. Okay. So the next step ensures that not only do we have the controls in place, but they are operating properly. This is going to be information and communication. So this supports all the control components by conveying details and responsibilities on internal controls, right? So internally, we talk about employees, departments, managers, and governance. This can be external as well as to customers, suppliers, regulators, and shareholders. So not only do we have controls, but the people who are responsible or not responsible, the people who are affected by those controls understand what their responsibilities are and how these controls affect them. So we have a control in place that's basically saying, do not log in, or to log into a computer, you have to have a valid user ID and a password, all right? And I communicate that to you. I say, all right, you have to have a valid user ID and a password. For that, do not write down your password on a piece of paper. Do not share your password with people in the class or other individuals. Why? That compromises the control. This is a piece of information that I'm communicating to you. Now, this is probably not something that you were communicated at the beginning. This is probably something you learned a long time ago. Don't share your passwords. Also, don't write down your passwords on a Post-it note and put it on your computer. It's funny how many people still do that. Although I understand, I get it. There's tons and tons of passwords out there, so it's hard to keep them organized, but it's just generally good not to record those anywhere. So yeah, that's communication related to the nature of control. The password itself is the control. The instruction that I say, don't write down your password where anybody can see it, that would be an example of communication related to that control. One is the control itself, the design of the control. The other one is making sure the control operates properly. All right. So the last component, let's think about this naturally. Do controls need to change over time? So to answer this question, let me ask it a different way. Do risks change over time? Okay. Can risks change in a very, very short period of time? So does anybody remember March 2020? I don't think most of you were probably at Truman. You probably were still in high school or maybe middle school at the time. Something really, really profound happened in March 2020. It was like the beginning of the month, we were all here on campus just enjoying our lives. And the rest of after that, we were saying, all right, don't come to campus. Don't come back to campus. What was that? That was COVID, the COVID pandemic. I'm sure you all were affected by that as well, okay? Regardless of the situation that you were in. Did that affect a lot of businesses? It certainly affected Truman. We had a big, big change that occurred. We had to teach all of our classes online for the rest of the semester, which I was okay with that. Some of the instructors were kind of like, I don't even know how to use a computer. So yeah, very, very interesting scenario that changed a lot of things, and it was a big risk of change. But this is an example of how risks can profoundly change over a very short period of time. A good organization can adapt and address these risks, and that's going to be something we call monitoring. It's the ongoing evaluation of the design and effectiveness of internal controls by management. As risks change, they should be discovered, and they should be evaluated and communicated in a timely manner, and modifications made as needed. It's very interesting because if you were here 5 years ago, let's say that we had the ability, we have this AIS time machine, all right? And I could put you guys in a time machine and we could go back 5 years to March 2020, and you could see how the situation was different. And technology was completely different. We didn't have these cameras right here in front of us. We did have web cameras that we could actually communicate, but it was not something that was listed or set up here. We did not have Zoom, or we were starting Zoom access, but it was very, very minimal. We were not really in protocols of how we could actually set up and we could actually communicate online. Most of the instructors did not have any online interaction whatsoever. And so there was just not protocols for actually teaching online, and it's completely and totally changed. It was a monitoring mechanism that we had was kind of forced onto us. We had to change, we had to adapt to the circumstances because otherwise we weren't going to survive. And I think a lot of students would argue some of the instructors were less effective than others in that regard, okay? Now, I'm sure that you probably had your own situations because you're in school where you're saying, all right, I'm in school and now I'm at home and I'm spending all my days at home. And that probably was a challenge as well. Some of your instructors probably met that challenge very effectively. Some of your instructors are probably like, I don't know what to do. This is not a situation I've ever been in, struggle in that situation. That's an example of good monitoring versus bad monitoring and be able to update to those new scenarios. So as organizations, as risks change, they have to be able to adapt to that. This is actually funny because this is one of those areas that I talk about from business perspective. How did organizations have to adapt? Well, if you're thinking about a company, think about a company like Cinemark. What is Cinemark? It's a movie theater chain. Their risks changed pretty substantially during the pandemic because people were not going out to see movies anymore. So how did they actually address that problem? Well, most of them panicked and they kind of said, we're just gonna have to wait this out. But they actually did some promotions and they said, all right, we're going to social distance you to where you're only going to be in a theater with like 10 people because they could show movies with 10 people and still make at least a little bit of money as opposed to not making any money at all. So people actually wanted to get out of the house. They could be socially distanced and do a part of that. So that was an address to a particular risk that was in place in there. That's not a really good scenario. I think other ones can be a little bit easier. Like if we talk about how Amazon actually flourished during the pandemic because a lot of people were really heavily in demand for staying at home and not going out to the grocery store because they didn't want to be around people. So that was an opportunity that they took advantage of as well. All right, I'm going to quit rambling about that. But for the most part, those are the 5 components of internal control. Like I said, I take these very seriously. We spent like the past 15 minutes just talking about these 5 components. Know these components in depth, okay? Not just their names, but what they represent, because they are very prominent, very critical. You may have covered these in another course before. If that's the case, great. If you've not, you're going to cover them in this course. You're going to cover them in other courses as well, okay? So for the COSO ERM, this is actually what the book tells you the ERM is, and I'm going to tell you right now, this is not the COSO ERM anymore, okay? They actually updated and revised it. This is what basically it looks like now. It's 5 components, and you will notice these components look really familiar. It's because the components are basically the COSO integrated control framework or internal control integrated framework, just with different terminology. In fact, you can kind of see they actually set it up and they say governance and culture, which is kind of control environment, strategy, objective setting, that's risk assessment, performance, control activities, review and revision. This is actually monitoring. They kind of flip-flop these. And information communication reporting would be information communication. So all you really need to know for COSO ERM framework is that it has different nomenclature. I will not even test you on what these items are. Okay, I promise I will not ask a question on this for the exam. All I'm going to let you know is that there is an ERM framework that is very loosely related to the a control framework. The reason that they have this, it goes back to what I said on here. Okay, it expands upon COSO 2013 to provide a broader view on risk management to maximize firm value. So with respect to the COSO framework, that's more about risk mitigation, whereas risk management in this context is more about how do we maximize firm value with risk as constraint. That's basically the ERM, Enterprise Risk Management Framework. All right, last thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the 3 IT internal control frameworks. So the first one I talked about is COBIT, Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. It is a framework for information technology governance and management. Now that seems like a very broad statement, and it is in fact. If you actually look at what IT or what COBIT tries to accomplish, it's just basically a guideline for how you can implement other frameworks. So COBIT by itself is very rarely used on its own. COBIT is very rarely used by itself. All right, it's usually used in unison with other frameworks. But the way it supports IT governance management, it basically says we are going to create controls that have the goal of maximizing firm value. Now, when we think about controls we tend to think about addressing risk, and we say that's going to be for security precautions. And this is when I first learned about COBIT several years ago. I was like, wow, this is profound, because their objective here is to maximize firm value. And it makes sense because if you think about the nature of a business, most businesses are in place to actually maximize value. That's the whole goal of the organization. You know, the constraint that we talked about earlier in the semester, we talked about that benefit has to be greater than cost. Why? Because you're defeating the goal of a business in the first place if you don't have accounting information provide benefit in excess of cost. Everything is going to be quantified and it's going to be based on the context of value. So COBIT is going to be its primary objective saying, if we have controls in place, they need to have the primary objective of maximizing firm value. We also want to make sure resources are used responsibly and IT risks are managed appropriately. Okay. So again, very broad concept here. We talk about COBIT, IT governance and management, provide some guidelines on how we can actually use those to manage firm resources and maximize firm value. Again, it is kind of broad. It doesn't actually have specific applications. It relies on other IT control frameworks to provide that. Fortunately, we're going to talk about other IT control frameworks. So the second of these we're going to talk about is going to be ITIL, Information Technology Infrastructure Library. It is a global framework for providing IT services and for establishing the scope of, and I want you to make a note of these last three words, I guess technically two initials and two words, IT service management, okay? IT service management. So the goal of ITIL is to actually provide a guideline for IT service management. And there's 5 categories that are listed here. I will not test you on the 5 categories. Again, this is very, very broad information. We're just going to keep it at a broad level. The most important thing you need to know is that ITIL is basically an IT service management framework. It is a lot more specific than COBIT in that it actually focuses on how do we actually provide the best services with respect to information technology and what are the security concerns that we have in that area. The last one we're going to talk about is going to be the ISO 27000. And you'll notice here that I said ISO 27000 series. There's not actually one standard in this area. There's a broad set of standards in this area, and these are actually constantly evolving. But the ISO 27000 series, this is actually designed to address information security. Okay. So again, we talked about ITIL, we talked about IT service management. What is the most appropriate way to provide the IT services within an organization? This is more focused on security itself. Okay. How do we actually maximize security in the organization? Now, how is this different from COBIT? Keep in mind that COBIT's primary objective is firm value. So security is going to be subject to the constraints that we talked about before. Benefit has to exceed the cost. With respect to ISO, it is completely and totally focused on information security. So we have to make sure that the organization has in place and in mind the security that's necessary for it to operate. So the goal of this is actually to create a mechanism which ISO is specified as an ISMS. And that's short for Information Security Management System, which is exactly what it sounds. It says that the controls that are in place under IT framework should be designed in such a way to maximize information security of all surrounding assets. Okay, so just to reiterate, COBIT, IT Management and Governance, ITIL, IT Service Management, ISO 27000 series, Information Security Management System. If you can remember that, you shouldn't basically know everything you need to know in those 3 areas of that. But those are the IT governance frameworks. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's a lot more depth than I really want to get into in the last 3 minutes of class. All right. And with that, we are done with our discussion of controls, but we still have homework to do on Wednesday, as well as our last NetSuite assignment. So I'll see you then.